So hello everyone, and welcome to the fifth, I believe, uniMIND Central session. I will be your tech host tonight. My name is Vlad. I work here as a research associate at the Mind Foundation, and I also do some coordination work for uniMIND. So as everyone is slowly joining the discussion, I would like to first present a few slides about what's going on in these sessions, a few words about uniMIND in general. So I will just quickly share my screen. Just 1 second. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So as you all know, this format is called the uniMIND Central Sessions, and it's based on our uniMIND network, which is basically a network of academic journal clubs with centers around Europe and now expanding into the United States as well. And Australia, and we hope to expand further. Basically, students and sometimes professors get together and discuss findings in the fields of psychedelic research and consciousness research. And the goals are just to create this academic network and facilitate discussion around these topics. So I will also at the same time admits people who are joining us while I'm speaking. So if you will excuse me sometimes for a second. Yes, we at Mind facilitate the interaction between these groups. And we also organize larger meetings, for example, the uniMIND Symposium, which is a yearly roadshow type event at different European universities, where researchers have the chance to come and present their research in psychedelic science or related fields. And it's usually co-hosted by local uniMIND groups. The most recent one was in Maastricht on the 9th of April, with the help from the local uniMIND group there. And personally, I think it was a really great event, and it facilitated great discussions, and people had the chance to also actively participate as students in discussions, and also a panel discussion, which was very much appreciated by our participants. So as most of you probably know, but for the people who are joining us today for the first time, the uniMIND Central Session is a format that we propose on every fourth Wednesday of the month. And it's open to everyone who is already part of uniMIND or joining us from the MCP, and is a 1 hour long session with the authors of different papers in the field, and it's hosted through our Zoom. We share the material in advance to facilitate discussion, and we usually have a moderator and the author of the paper who discuss the findings and methods, and generally the impact of their research in a more free-flowing conversation mode. So the concept in general is at first the study rationale and background, then it pretty much follows the structure of a scientific paper. And of course, we would encourage people to also spontaneously join the conversation, facilitated by Max. You can ask questions at any time, just speak up or use the raise hand function in Zoom. So without further ado, I wish you a fun and insightful discussion. And now I will invite the moderator, Max Wolf, who is my colleague and also a researcher here at Mind and at Charité, to present himself and also introduce Kevin for this further discussion. So welcome, Max and Kevin, and yeah, I wish everyone a lively and fun discussion.
Thank you, Vlad. Thank you very much. So yeah, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Max Wolf. I'm a psychologist and a psychotherapist. I currently work, apart from Mind, at the Charité University Hospital in Berlin, where we conduct a study, the episode study, which is a study where we treat 144 patients with treatment-resistant depression with psilocybin-assisted therapy. So I work in that project as a researcher and also as a study therapist. At the Mind Foundation, my function is I'm the head of psychotherapy training and research. So I oversee and develop the APT program, Augmented Psychotherapy. If you're interested in that, you can check our website. Maybe Vlad can post a link. Yeah, and our guest today is Kevin St. Arnaud. He is a registered psychologist and assistant professor of clinical psychology at Concordia University of Edmonton in Canada. He formerly worked at the Cross Cancer Institute, where he completed his doctoral residency in clinical psychology with a specialization in psychosocial oncology and palliative care. Kevin has taught undergraduate and graduate courses on professional ethics, psychotherapy, development, and psychopathology. His research primarily concerns transpersonal psychology, positive adult development, and the establishment of frameworks for conceptualizing positive drug use. Welcome, Kevin.
Great. Well, no, thanks very much for that introduction, Max, and thanks everyone for having me. Thanks for that intro here today, Vlad. And yeah, really happy to be here and to have a really hopefully awesome and open chat with everyone that's showed up. So thanks for coming, everyone.
What time is it where you are, Kevin?
It's 11:15 a.m.
Okay.
And there's a light dusting of snow coming down at the moment.
Great. So I suppose we're finished before your lunch today, and probably right about time for dinner here in Germany. Vlad, how much time do we have? When are we supposed to finish?
Theoretically at 8, so 45 more minutes.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, okay, so the paper we're going to discuss today was published in 2021 in the journal Drugs Education, Prevention and Policy. And Kevin is the the only author of this paper. And the paper is called Toward a Positive Psychology of Psychoactive Drug Use. Kevin, maybe do you want to say a few words on what made you write that paper, or how did you come up with the idea for writing it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess I'll start at the beginning. During my graduate studies, I became very interested in humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology, particularly Maslow's work on peak experiences. And from there, I got into awe and self-transcendence and mystical states and these kinds of things, expanded consciousness and the farther reaches of human nature, as Maslow put it. And Maslow does mention in one of his texts, Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences, that yeah, he's aware of the emerging psychedelic research that Leary was doing and other folks were doing, and thought, hey, maybe this would be an opportunity to in some way foster self-actualization, given that they could evoke peak experiences. And so that was discovered, pretty earlier on in the first phase. So that really kind of tipped me into an interest in psychoactive compounds and psychedelics in particular, but also cannabis and a few other different classes. But the more I got into that and the more I became interested in the psychotherapy and the modalities there, the more I became really just interested in the social justice issue of drug use, drug criminalization, the war on drugs, um, and this reality that I thought was really kind of overshadowed, particularly in medicine and clinical psychology. As I note in the paper, it's a little different in sociology and anthropology. But so in clinical psychology and medicine, where drugs are essentially just tarred with only a black brush, I suppose you could say, where we just ignore the positives. We ignore the benefits of substance use. We ignore pleasure. We deny these things, and we just only talk about harm. We only talk about addiction, despite statistically that not reflecting reality. And so along with my studies in kind of adult development and the use of psychedelics, I think just that interweaves with this notion of changing the public discourse around drugs to essentially bring it out of the unconscious, if you will, the notion of a positive side to drug use, and to just fully acknowledge that. So I see it in kind of in line with notions of sex education and different kind of attitudes and things that are considered taboo or that we repress for whatever reason. And clearly there's something that frightens us about drug use kind of in our collective consciousness. So I think that's what drove the paper.
All right. Okay. So I was thinking when reading the paper, there are a lot of interesting concepts that I was not aware of before. So there is one section towards the beginning of the paper where you talk about resistance or potential sources of resistance to a positive psychology of drug use. And the concept that caught my attention was pharmacological Calvinism. So do you, right, as in the reformist, or I don't know in English, but the Protestant Church of Calvinism. Do you believe that this is just let's say just an elegant term, or does it really have to do with Protestant Christianity, or do we also find these attitudes in, for example, more Catholic societies?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. I'm glad that you kind of touched on that, Max. Yeah, that notion came from a paper, I believe, from the 70s by an American physician, if I recall, and it really struck me. And I think that there's some kernel of truth here, maybe not in the sense of directly tied to the church itself, but to the kind of deeper undercurrents that we saw in the church. And now I know that, you know, in Germany and in Europe in general, my understanding from my little studies in the psychology of religion, its evolutionary course is quite different than Protestantism in the United States and North America writ large. They were a bit different given our French Catholic influence in Canada in a different kind of context, in a different way. But I think that there's something true there, that it's informed, particularly given that the war on drugs largely started, the epicenter was the United States, and was exported to the rest of the world essentially by force. I think that there's some truth there. I think that in some way there's this notion of altered states, of in some way getting away from a working mindset, moving into more of a being kind of mindset, is in some way a sin or close to being devilish in some kind of way. And again, this is coming from deeper stratum of the psyche, and the extent to which it kind of pervades culture, particularly again American and North American culture. So that it might have kind of different connotations in Europe. Actually, I'm not sure, but just as you're broaching it now, I'm kind of thinking about it in a different way.
So, yeah, the reason it caught my eye was that my family has a Calvinist background. On my father's side, his grandmother, I think, was Calvinist from the Netherlands, and he tells me that when they were kids, they had dessert, so they were allowed to enjoy things. Yeah, so there was dessert after dinner, but they weren't allowed to turn the spoon in the mouth as a sign of too much pleasure. So you can eat the dessert, but you shouldn't enjoy it too much.
Right.
So, I suppose this is also what makes drug use perhaps suspicious to many Puritan societies, especially religious societies. is just pleasure.
Right, right, exactly. That's a beautiful anecdote. Thank you for sharing that, Max. That's fascinating. So I mean, I think that speaks beautifully too. There being something here that, yeah, this notion of pleasure, of leisure, of trying to move into kind of a being mode of consciousness is in some way taking you away from work, you know, idle hands are the devil's hands or something like that. I think that there's even some more, you could get into some Jungian kind of frames there, but maybe we'd come back to that. That gets a bit arcane at that point.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
And also for sure, I mean, pleasure is certainly not the only positive effect or potential positive effect of drug use. I think you will tell us more about the diversity of potential positive effects of psychedelics in particular, but also drug use in more in general. But before we get to that, I'd like to ask, what are sources of skepticism or resistance towards a potential or a positive psychology of drug use and psychedelic use in particular?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the big pieces that that I try to dispel in the paper is this notion that, or I use alcohol as a really good point of comparison. Has cannabis been legalized in Germany yet, by the way, or is it?
No, yeah. So our new government, I think they promised it when they formed the coalition, but I don't think anything has happened since then. I mean, other things are more important right now, so we're also not paying a lot of attention.
Other things are going on in
but
the
it
world
might
at the
happen
moment.
in the next. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it might happen. It's probably going to happen within this election period.
Right, right. So it's coming up. Yeah. So we can extend, you know, to use cannabis as well, but I like to use alcohol just because it's fairly ubiquitous in Western nations, its use. And we recognize implicitly the understanding that there is alcohol use and there's alcohol abuse, and that there is a continuum there. We understand that implicitly. You don't have to say that. You don't have to make that explicit. But as soon as you talk about things like cannabis, and still in Canada, cannabis is often assumed, oh, you use cannabis, you abuse cannabis. So there's a conflation. And that's one of the big, I think, starting blocks that you have to start with is the fact that you can use a whole source of different types of drugs, even drugs that are often considered highly addictive, and not have an abusive relationship in the same way that you can with alcohol. That really, really needs to be dispelled and corrected. And I do it with my students all the time when they're talking about substance use. It's like, no, be very careful with your vernacular. This is technically incorrect. There's all sorts of stigma. There's all sorts of stigma that goes along with being labeled a drug user. Even the fact, and I mentioned this in the paper, that we often say, are you an alcohol or drug user? It's not just, are you a drug user?
That's international. That in German language, it's like that as well. On the news or in government reports, people speak of drugs and alcohol. Yeah. So there's another term that caught my eye related to this in your paper. It's drug apartheid.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, no, I really liked that term when I came across it, and I think it's really interesting. I mean, we see that with the legal drugs, or at least alcohol. Alcohol holds a special place, of course. I mean, I don't know the current status of how tobacco is perceived, let's say in Europe, but in North America, it's perceived as quite, there's stigma against tobacco in North America, I guess would be a way to phrase that. And so there's differing levels. You're either on this side or you're on that side of a drug being good or bad. And there's some pretty hard lines that are drawn in the sand in that regard. You're either on the good side or the bad side, and we'll even give you potentially a different term to differentiate you from drugs. And again, language really, really matters in terms of how we frame, how we think. And so I think that's always an important place to start.
I think tobacco is a fascinating example, or a fascinating outlier, maybe in compared to other drugs. First of all, because it's legal in at least in most places, and then also on the other hand, it's a drug that, at least when it's used the way it's supposed to be used in the way we use it in our society, it hardly has any positive effects that are at least they're known to in the literature. That doesn't mean that individual smokers may not. There may not be individual smokers who as a net effect, have positive effects of it. But so what I'm getting at is that the fact that we have a legal drug that has almost no, or really, where it's really hard to imagine any positive longer-term effects. And then we have alcohol, where there is this continuum, and most alcohol users have unproblematic or relatively little problematic use, and undoubtedly there are positive uses of alcohol.
I believe Natalie, sorry to interrupt, I believe Natalie has a question.
Oh, okay. But let me just finish this
Sure.
point just quickly. So, but alcohol, even alcohol compared to other drugs, when you look at this drug ranking from the NAT and Amsterdam paper, even alcohol is a relatively harmful drug compared to even most illegal drugs. So does this lack of correlation, or let's even say it's almost like a negative correlation between the legal status of drugs and their harmfulness, does this affect the way people think about illegal drugs, and does it put them at a disadvantage?
I see Natalie's question. I definitely want to get to that, but
Yes.
yeah, I think there's a couple really interesting points that you broached there, Max. One is, of course, just pure irony, right? That two drugs that are extremely dangerous in many respects in terms of causing all sorts of physical harms, abuse potential, etc. And yet these are legal drugs. I don't know the literature on cannabis well, so I don't want to speak to its pros, because I'm certain there must be. Particularly if you look at tobacco globally, and I was speaking with an indigenous gentleman here in Canada, and he was telling me, how tobacco is very much a venerated substance for these folks. And so I'm not sure how Westerners' use of tobacco, how similar it is to perhaps other ways of instrumentalizing tobacco, other ways of approaching with a different kind of intentionality. So that's just an area of my own ignorance. I don't know much about tobacco, but I would imagine that there's some interesting perspectives there. But yeah, I mean, the huge irony is that we have alcohol legal despite it having fairly high abuse potential, despite the fact that you can overdose. And I don't know what the numbers are in Germany, but in Canada and the United States, there's thousands of acute deaths just from overdosing alcohol every year. And so when we look at that and we hold that up and go, oh yeah, people can use this in a controlled manner. But then we look at a drug like cannabis or psilocybin containing mushrooms, which are unbelievably safe, and yet they're rendered illegal. It's hypocrisy. It's completely antithetical to science and reason, which is big problem, I think, for an evidence-based society, something that we might aspire to. And perhaps we don't. I don't know, but it's worth considering. Yeah.
Natalie.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to point out some information about tobacco, because when I was back in Ukraine, I used to conduct shamanic ceremonies using Nicotiana rustica. This means like sacred tobacco used by indigenous people in America. And actually, it also creates psychedelic effects just for 20 minutes approximately. And it helps people balance themselves and heal, which is a completely another perspective put on tobacco compared to the Western one, I guess.
Thank you for sharing that. That's fascinating. Would you have any literature that you could perhaps point to me in that direction?
Well, not that I can think about in the moment, but
yeah, not to put you on the spot. Yeah,
I will definitely.
Thank you. Yeah, fascinating, and such a great point.
If anybody knows something, feel free to post in the chat. So Kevin, there is a term, another term that appears in your paper at least 2 or 3 times. It's like when drug use goes right, or when recreational drug use goes well. It sounds a bit like it's in the formula, like the way you say it, or the way this is said. To many people, this would sound like an exception when
Yeah,
drug
yeah.
use goes right. But apparently, empirically, this may be more the rule than an exception.
Yeah.
Maybe you could, from a positive psychology perspective, answer the question: what has to happen for drug use to go well or to go right? What are the necessary ingredients?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really interesting question. And so if we first start at that notion of the spectrum, and I cite one that's been put forth tentatively by the governments of British Columbia, so one of our provinces here, which is pretty interesting to see, pretty good to see that a government document would be open to this kind of thing. Of course, it comes from our most progressive province in the entire country. On the one hand, you have chronic dependence, and then as you move towards the center, you have kind of more problematic abuse. Then as you move to the kind of more positive side, you have controlled use or just kind of neutral use, and then you move up into positive instrumentalization or positive use that has demonstrable beneficial impacts on your social functioning, your work, your relationships, your spirituality, your existential relationship with life, or whatever it might be, your mental well-being, those kinds of things. So if we look then at the kind of the more positive end of the spectrum, or actually, I mean, we could look at it broadly because the same variables are at play. I think first, you pharmacology of the drug, that's very, very important. And so I mentioned that you need to, in medicine and in clinical psychology, we think of a biopsychosocial, existential, spiritual paradigm to understanding the human being, that you really can't detach them from any of those. And so I think that for drug use, we're going to need the same thing. What is an individual's personal, physiological, or genetic makeup? And that really does come into play because we know that there are differences that people have in terms of their metabolism of substance that are based on different kind of very basic biological differences. And so you start there, you look at different drugs in terms of their safety profile, LD50, therapeutic index, so the relative safety of a drug, its capacity for abuse. And you mentioned NUT. I did some really great work there. And there was another paper that was, from 2010, looking at similar kind of things there. Some good psychopharmacologists. So then you move up and you look, okay, what are the kind of social parameters, set and setting kind of thing. What are your intentions? Why are you doing it? Are you taking that psilocybin mushroom with eye shades on and instrumental music and going inward, creating a safe kind of context? Or are you maybe taking it in more of a reckless kind of context for the purposes of whatever it might be, partying or that kind of thing? Not to say that that's bad, but it's going to have a real different outcome. Who are you with? The social context. Dosing is really important. I speak to that a bit in terms of trying to optimize the state of consciousness for a particular task that you're hoping to work on. Trying to optimize it by using the smallest dose, right, to limit any potential toxicity. This might not be a huge issue with drugs like LSD or psilocybin or cannabis that are extremely safe physiologically, but other drugs, even something like MDMA, okay, you're starting to get a little bit more dangerous given the amphetamine properties. How about opiates? Same thing there. Your threshold in terms of a safety window, right? So you want to minimize the dose as much as you possibly can. And so I'd say that those are the very big ones. And then I think I mentioned, who are you with? What is your context? Are you with a bunch of strangers you don't know and you've just taken a whole bunch of LSD? Or are you with one or two extremely trusted individuals in a very safe context, and now you're taking the same or less LSD, right? So you have to think on all these different levels simultaneously, and hopefully try to tune the knobs of all of them to dial in what's optimal. And again, I think it depends largely on what your goal is or how you're intending to instrumentalize it.
But you mentioned intentions as a primary or central determinant of positive longer term effects or of a positive use of drugs. So we did a study recently, a survey study on psychedelics, where we also looked at, among other things, at intentions, and we found that apparently what really matters when it comes to intentions is the distinction between avoidance and approach motives. So would you agree that that avoidance motivated drug use is inherently less beneficial than approach motivated drug use?
Yeah, no, I mean, I really like that distinction. I think that's great. I think that's brilliant. And I think that in a certain sense, that is true. I think in a very famous text called Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered by Grinspoon and Bachelor, it's from the late 70s. Excellent. I recommend that. It holds up well today. You know, they speak to this point. Ralph Metzner spoke to this point as well, that with psychedelics, typically you're not taking them to escape reality. You're taking them to fling yourself into reality full bore, right? To open the door and just be kind of blown away by experience. And as anyone that's taken psychedelics knows, it can be often quite a harrowing and painful experience. And that's kind of the point, if that's what you're looking for, right? And so that's very much an approach as opposed to this avoidance, trying to just kind of bliss out using a ton of opiates or something like that. And we'd say, okay, that's, you know, probably problematic. My contention as a clinician as well, though, is that although that's true, that's speaking to the underlying, still, I think, an instrumentalization of folks that are abusing opiates, which is they're trying to run from the sorrow of the tragedy of their life. And yet they're stigmatized for using a coping mechanism that, yes, admittedly, is maybe not helping things. It's maybe not the optimal coping mechanism. But it's so funny that we're so quick to shame them and to shun them and all. You know, I often say that drug users are, particularly individuals with drug abuse problems, they're one of the most socially acceptable groups to stigmatize remaining in society, because they're also most individuals heavily criminalized as well, on top of having, you know, often deep-seated trauma and these kinds of things. It's tragic. To me, it's quite gross, actually. So I agree, but we have to be looking at what still is the coping going on here. What is the benefit that they're getting, and that is escaping horror, perhaps.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. There's a question from Daniela. Daniela.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. Talking about set and setting, I read a book about ritual, like the use of psychedelics in rituals in shamanic cultures. For example, ayahuasca, and they talk a lot about like the rituals that have to be performed in before and after in order to get these kind of positive experiences through the use of psychedelics. I wonder how actually possible, or like, yeah, it is to have in our Western society all of these rituals, considering like dieting, meditation. And also for me, it was really interesting to see that after the use, it is crucial also to have the integration phase in which you integrate all of what you've gathered through this experience afterwards and make it part of your life. And I don't know if you could say something about it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Daniela. Two really, really interesting points there. First, you speak to the point of a kind of ritual before and after, and then how that ties into integration. What I think that you're speaking to in a way, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, is to a large measure in the West, we're kind of vapid in terms of psycho-spiritual ritual, in kind of what's been described as resacralizing life in whatever way, right? We're really kind of yearning for that. We're I think crying out for that. You know, a number of different kind of authors in the 20th century and now have written about that we're missing something. And so you bring up a really important point, which is if you don't have those kind of psycho-spiritual contexts and meaning systems for essentially helping to control and moderate the use of a drug and to optimize its usage, how do you just develop them? And I think that that's a huge part of what I'm really interested in, is what are the context, the biological, psychological, social, cultural, and spiritual contexts in the West, right? And what, you know, how do we design them? How do we develop them? I think a lot of this knowledge does exist, but it's actually beginning to systematize it and to study it and to, I mean, do what the West does, you know, as broadly speaking, which is create maps and frames and do science and all this stuff, you know. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting, and I think it probably an important, hopefully an important research trajectory for this century and going forward. And yeah, and you mentioned integration as well, and that's huge, which is that, and actually I have some papers, another paper that I had that just came out in early this year, a couple months ago, looked at that variable, and integration predicted beneficial recreational use outcomes. It was one of the most important predictor variables. Was, do you actively reflect on and strive to integrate your drug experiences into your daily life? That variable was critical, even after controlling for 10 other variables or something like that, the regression. And so beginning to have some actual empirical data that not only in psychedelic therapy, but also amongst recreational users, this is critical. If you're not going, wow, what did that mean when I was, you know, on the bathroom floor vomiting my guts out on mushrooms because the horror that I was encountering from my own psyche was coming at me. You're not reflecting on that. What are you getting from that necessarily, right? And yeah, I mean, that's long been talked about in the psychedelic literature, but I think now really beginning to validate that and show that we have to be doing that. So
I like what you said about do what the West does. That made me think of what we're doing right now, right? We're doing a uniMIND central session on psychedelics. And superficially, it looks very different from dieting before an ayahuasca session, but it may be a cultural equivalent. That's just maybe more fitting with our specific culture. I mean, sometimes we don't realize how very specific our culture is because it's so dominant. But yeah, this is how we roll. We do Zoom meetings, we discuss, we write papers. Okay, there are two questions. I think Nin has been up first. Nin, you want to say something?
Yeah, so I work in the supportive housing sector in Victoria, BC, and for those who don't know what that is, it's essentially like the BC government bought a bunch of like hotels and then just took all of the unhoused population and put them into it. And so pretty much every single person in there have like horrible trauma and a lot of drug use that's not controlled at all. And we have a very progressive framework of harm reduction and safe consumption. And so, like, for example, people just like, they'll be using heroin or smoking meth or crack, like in the common areas in their room, just outside the front door. But it's interesting, this idea of like trauma and addictions, I think, because some of these like unhoused folks have almost like so much trauma that the counseling kind of method of like psychotherapy almost isn't effective because of how entrenched they are in their current drug use and way of life. That, like, for example, we have, I think, counselors that come once a week for about 4 hours, and we're lucky if we get like 2 to 4 of 120 people to go to these sessions. And a quick side note, it's horrible. In BC, counselor isn't a protected term. And so we have an OT and a registered nurse providing therapy, providing counseling to these people. And that in of itself is an issue because when you're dealing with such, intense levels of trauma, like some of those two might not necessarily have the skills or the knowledge to be able to deal with it. And so I think where psychedelics could really help bridge that gap, at least when you think about like ibogaine or something, where not only can you really get into the depths of trauma, but it can actually physiologically help break that addiction in a way that a lot of other substances can, and can also go the other way and make it much, much worse. But for anyone who knows the addiction system in BC, perhaps Canada, the detox system is an absolute joke. It's 7 days, and then they send you back to the streets, unless you have a social worker or someone who's able to actually get you into the right housing and follow-ups.
Lynn, let me just, do you have a question to Kevin also?
It was kind of just a talking point of like how psychedelics could be used in the unhoused population, these really at risks to deal with, very, very severe trauma when perhaps the current medical system isn't working.
You want to comment on that, Kevin?
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks for that, Nin. Yeah, I mean, good on you for working in the sector that you do. That's really admirable. I mean, you speak to a really interesting and intractable issue here, which is that, yes, I mean, many of these folks that have all sorts of psychosocial issues in their lives that are, as you say, they don't have a home, all sorts of trauma. Likely they have very shoddy and sporadic educational records, don't have supportive networks probably, or a whole bunch of family necessarily that are going to be there to support them, not great social network systems around them, as you said, the therapists, the folks that are there to try and help them, the kind of the bottom of the barrel because just no one cares, right? So it does feel actually pretty hopeless at times. And I absolutely believe that psychedelic assisted psychotherapies can help with trauma and to unearth it and to actually process it, to hopefully begin to move the person away from the place where they have to use different kinds of drugs to escape from life, as Max said, that avoidance, right? We want to help that, but it's more than just trauma. It's also, what's the education here? Do they have a place where they can now get out and be functional in society and all those things where we'd say someone, it's a very, very difficult problem. And yeah, I mean, the mental health treatment of folks is definitely going to have to improve. And I think that drug-assisted therapies are going to be a huge part of that. But it's more than that. It's also a sociological question, a question for social workers and for politicians as well. And, the problem of houselessness is just age old and seemingly intractable. I don't know how it's done in Europe, if there's any headway made there, but certainly it's a huge problem, of course, over here, and I would imagine in Europe as well, to a greater or lesser extent. But that's again a political issue. So great question though, Nin.
Well, yeah, if I may comment on that, in Europe we have the same problem as in North America, maybe not to such extremes, that the problem is being that the medical system or the mental health treatment system fails mostly with the most severely ill. Mm-hmm. We have an okay system for people with mild problems, but for the severely mentally ill, our system is not adequate.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think the huge piece there, just as a final note there, is that poverty itself is a massive issue in mental illness. We know that it both can maintain and cause the development of psychopathology, right? So unless society in some way is addressing poverty, it's going to be a catalyst for enduring psychopathology and the more severe and extreme forms that are often comorbid with substance abuse. So it's very difficult, very difficult.
Also, interesting phenomenon that we tend to shift towards a pathological angle, even when talking about a positive psychology paper.
Right, exactly, isn't that? And I mean, and we should, because these folks, I think it's very interesting because, it speaks to this fact that there is a continuum, but we often hone in on the individuals that are, well, yeah, using substances in a way that's in some way deleterious, although it's going to have some benefits, right? It's going to have some benefits. So, yeah.
Henry. You want to ask a question, Henry?
Yeah, maybe a question more to the non-pathologized population, and especially to positive drug use. I mean, if even the current system for people with mental illness fails, it seems to me obvious that it is necessary to have some kind of overarching framework that maybe in integration work or in group work enables good outcomes of deep psychedelic experiences. And how could such a way look like? Could it be even something institutionalized, especially something apart from therapy? What do you think about that?
Right. Yeah, really cool question, Henry. So if I'm kind of understanding you, what you're getting at is, do we have some kind of structural institution in place that individuals that are not necessarily seeking a therapist per se, but are kind of maybe wanting personal growth, and develop relationships with folks and have kind of psychedelic experiences or journeys or whatever it might be, and integrate it, but not in a strictly treating a disorder kind of way, in more of a self-expansion, spirituality, etc. ways. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Henry? Yeah, I mean, I think that actually goes back to Daniela's question to some extent, which is, what does it mean? And I think this is part of, I think, a very interesting psychological question and spiritual question. What does it mean in the West, for Western consciousness, to accept the validity of non-rational states as beneficial, as useful? There's an old term in psychoanalytic thought called regression in the service of the ego, and it was expanded to regression in the service of the self in a kind of more Jungian frame, which I think is even more interesting. But we kind of never really developed that notion a whole heck of a lot, and I think that it's one that should return. I was actually reflecting on that this morning, which is, what does it mean to say, yes, there are periods where you should develop a trip cave, and with a few close friends, put on some instrumental drones and take mushrooms and go inward for a while to reflect on your life, to develop humility, to kind of work out some stuff, to maybe grieve a little bit. I don't know. I think this is kind of the part of the frontier. So I think that that's part of what maybe your mission will be, Henry, is to partly develop those frames. And I think that's what uniMIND is to its own extent and to its own way is contributing to that, I would imagine. So it's an exciting and open question. But one of the big hurdles is legalizing substances. So it's not just allowing them in the hands of therapists, but also saying, yeah, anyone can access cannabis, anyone can access psilocybin, and legality is a huge stumbling block. So Rick Doblin, who, for those of you that don't know, he's the kind of head president of MAPS in the United States, really important organization, and he says that the pathway to recreation and to these kind of psychospiritual modes of psychedelic and MDMA and cannabis use is legalization. If you look at the stats from cannabis, the way it went in the attitudes in the United States, is that when a place first legalizes it for medical purposes, then inevitably the door is now open to saying, okay, well, the world didn't collapse. Maybe we can just kind of regulate this and legalize it. And that's exactly what happened in Canada, despite the protestations of the kind of more right-wing, the conservative side, that that heaven would fall down. Absolutely nothing happened bad, negative. We've just got generated billions of dollars in tax revenue, and that's about it. And of course, took it more out of the hands of youth, which is advantageous as well for a society. So yeah, again, it's evidence-based. We're trying to be evidence-based, right? And if we did that honestly, we would improve society.
Kevin, this point of legalization, it brings us also to the last part of your paper, where you talk about reconsidering drug regulation and education policy. Yeah, speaking of legalization, what changes would you like to see, based on your reasoning? What changes would you like to see in terms of drug regulation and also in terms of our educational systems?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Max. And I also see that Justin has his hand up there too. I love that you did, in fact, bring those together, and because I do have them linked in the paper, because I think that they have to go hand in hand without question. If you want to legalize LSD, if you want to legalize MDMA, if you want to legalize cannabis even, and we're seeing this in Canada, you're going to need public health education, but I think even the in-school education needs to change big time. We know that drug abuse resistance education, I don't know if you have the DARE program in Europe, but in North America we do. And the empirical research on it that's been conducted shows that it actually can make things worse, because it's just so full of essentially falsity. It's fake. A lot of it's just fake. It's just not honest, and adolescents see through bullshit rapidly. We're not honest about drugs. And so if we want to legalize drugs, we have to be honest about them, which is that, yes, you can abuse them. Yes, they can be deleterious, and they can be wonderful and pleasurable and spiritually enlightening and enhance social communion with other folks and all sorts of wonderful things. And that comes down to other variables, not the drug in and of itself or drug use in and of itself, but how, why, when, where, how, with who, all those variables. You have to be thinking, but that means a more mature society, right? And these are some difficult questions.
Speaking of this, I reached to my bookshelf. This is a book co-authored by Henrik Jung-Aberle, director of the Mind Foundation. High Sein, which means to be high or being high. It's an educational book for young people.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's very. I don't think they have it in English yet.
Oh,
but it's
no.
very balanced, and it's education about positive drug use, but also harm reduction. And I'm considering giving this to my nephew when he turns something like 13 or 14, but I'm not sure yet how I'm going to explain it to my
Right.
sister.
Right. Interesting. Well, I would love an English translation of that volume. I regrettably can't speak German, but that sounds fascinating. Yeah.
It's a good example, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe last question from the audience, Justin.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just had a question, Kevin, about on the pathology side of things, it's perhaps simpler to operationalize what an improvement is from psychedelics. So you can say, do they meet the criteria for this type of pathology, and does the psychedelic alleviate that? But on the positive side, I think it's perhaps a bit more ambiguous. So I was wondering if you could speak to how you can see what you would like to see, I guess, in operationalizations and research for what the benefits could be.
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. I mean, there's more focus on, I mean, we have the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in North America, and in or the rest of the world uses the ICD to a large extent, or greater or lesser extent. And these kind of constructs, despite having all sorts of problems and being very heterogeneous, and we could talk about psychopathology and its issues, but we have some good constructs and some good categories, at least help us to kind of hone in, and we have assessment tools, as you point out. And so this is, I mean, I love that you asked this question, because this is really where my research is focused. At least kind of some of my more empirical research, this is more of an essay, is using measures from positive psychology, using measures from transpersonal psychology, and asking individuals that use drugs to take these, not just measures of symptoms of anxiety and these kinds of things with individuals that are pathological, but looking at folks that are going to ayahuasca retreats and maybe doing pre and post test measures using measures of creativity or self-compassion, or of different kinds of whatever it might be that you're interested in, changes in values, personality structure. They're just not funding, right? And so this is the problem with science, is where does the funding come from? I can tell you that the government of Canada is extremely reticent to want to fund my research, because I'm explicit that I want to look at the positive side of these things, and that's a bit taboo, right? And so that's a huge part. That I think that's partly why we've limited it. Despite, yeah, it's difficult to measure or to define and measure certain positive attributes, but not that difficult, right? I mean, we have good measures of big 5 personality traits. We have really excellent measures that have come about, and so I think that with humanistic psychology and the kind of more empirical shift with positive psychology, that's just a matter of time before we start to see these things. And it's just partly the funding, partly the will, and partly the openness and courage of scientists to say, no, I'm actually interested in these questions. I'm going to do it, despite protestations of whatever, despite protestations of maybe even funding bodies, right? And yeah, so I think that's what's going to take. But yeah, great question, Justin.
Yeah, really good question. I would have a lot of follow-ups on that. I just had some thoughts that I really have to bite my tongue not to ask, because we're already so late. Maybe a last very, very short question to you, Kevin. If you could just summarize or give us a take-home message, like a one-sentence take-home message, what would it be?
Oh dear, that's a difficult question, Max. I don't know. I think it's probably goes without saying for most of the individuals that are here. Many of the points. I think it's just, yeah, that drugs can be used or abused. There's a whole spectrum. There's a continuum. Kind of, as I said earlier, It's how you use them, with who you use them, how much you're using, the type, all those variables come into play. So, okay, yeah, that's all kind of trite. Now, what I really want to say is what I had talked about at the very end of the paper, which is a huge part of this is coming out of the closet, to use that metaphor, which is drug users, positive recreational drug users, need to start being open about that. This is very difficult. This is very difficult. There's stigma, there's criminalization as a threat, right? This is what I talked about earlier, which is that drug users are also at fear, oh, I want to, admit that I am so-and-so, I'm from this particular minority. Well, in most parts of the West, you're no longer criminalized for being gay, for example. That was changed up into, actually, I'm not even sure when that came off the books in most European countries, but relatively recently, but you're still criminalized in some parts of the world. We don't do that in the West anymore, right? We still criminalize people that want to use acid or that want to use opiates or MDMA. We'll lock them in a cage. How do we change that? Well, part of it is that folks that are successful, that are well-adjusted, that can be a counterbalancing force to say, yeah, no, there's a whole spectrum of folks out there. And yes, drug abuse is problematic, but we should be having compassion there. And we should be open and honest about the benefits maybe that our lives are accruing on a function of our, hopefully, judicious substance use. So I'll end with that note, I think.
A long sentence, Kevin.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we could go on for much longer. Maybe we'll have another chance at some point, perhaps at one of our conferences here. I don't know if you're interested in checking out the Insight conference. 2023 is the next one, right, Vlad?
Yes, it's in 2023. We will have, I believe, a German-speaking Insight Symposium this year, but I think that doesn't apply to everyone here present. So yeah, thanks again, Max and Kevin for joining us, and of course thanks everyone else for also tuning in. This was a really wonderful conversation, and I'm really glad to have taken part in this as well. Yes, I would like to invite everyone else to our future uniMIND Central sessions, again, 4th Wednesday of the month. We will have the 6th one on the 25th of May, I believe. So stay tuned in. And additionally, we will have our philosophy series beginning this Friday. So with the first session would be a conversation about the concept of the psychedelic experience in itself, as it was envisioned by Humphrey Osmond, and how it developed throughout the time. I will quickly post a link here for anyone interested. And yeah, thank you everyone again, and I wish you all a great evening.
Oh, just one moment, if I may, Vlad. I just see that there's a question there by Naz Uzan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, about paper. I just published it in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs. I think it came out in February of this year. Yeah, I can let me see. Let me just find that reference really quickly here. And I can send a copy of the paper out to as well, if anyone would like that.
Let's post it here if we can.
See if I can find it here. All right, here it is.
There it is now. Be fast with copy and paste. Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Goodbye. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, everybody. This was lovely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.